Hello and welcome back to Market Research Realities, MR Realities as we like to call it. My name's Dave McCaughan and I'm based in Bangkok. I work with my good friend Kevin Gray, who lives up there in Tokyo. And we try to bring together interesting people in the marketing and particularly the market research world to talk about the latest trends and what we think is going on and what we have problems with. And today we're actually going to talk about something a little bit different, but we're going to talk about storytelling from the eyes of a market researcher who's become a novelist. So, Kevin, would you like to introduce our guest?
Well, his blogging name is Rickie Khosla, if I've pronounced that correctly, and he's a former colleague of mine at Nielsen Customize. Ironically, he was based in New York. I was based in Asia when we were working together. I'm from New York, and he's from Asia. So whatever, you live and learn. Hi, Rickie.
Hey guys, my pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Okay. So you've had a very interesting life, much shorter than mine thus far. But you've done a lot of things and been a lot of places, and not kind of a 9 to 5 sort of guy. Could you just give us a quick background on on who you are, where you came from, what you do, what you've done?
Yeah, so I've been with market research for I don't know, years now, decades. I don't want to give a specific number, but it's been a long time. And I kind of, and I don't know how it went with you guys, but I kind of stumbled into market research because, nobody grows up saying, oh, I want to be a market researcher when I grow up. So I was actually looking for a summer job. This was when I was, I think, 20. And somebody told me that, oh, summer jobs, you could, do survey research, like the folks we have walking around with those little paper questionnaires in those lovely days of, better data quality. So somebody recommended that. And I said, okay. So in those days, we used to have those heavy duty telephone directories, if you remember. So just I opened that, and the only company I kind of knew of was IMRB, Indian Market Research Bureau in Delhi. So I opened this telephone directory and I, go to the listing of IMRB and there is that address there. And I just, the next morning at 9 o'clock, I show up at the office and I walk up to the receptionist and she looks at me and I say, oh, I've come here for a job. And she's like, wondering why I'm even there. And she just makes me sit there because nobody, like at 9 o'clock, normally nobody's in the office that early in India. So I'm like sitting and waiting there, not realizing that I was at the main research head office rather than the field office where I ought to have gone. Yeah, so I'm like sitting in the wrong office. And then a little while later, the MD of IMRB at the time, she walks past me and I guess she calls the receptionist from her room and says, oh, who's this fellow sitting out there? And so they must have had some conversation. So then I'm summoned into the room of the MD. So the MD calls me and I'm sitting there and not knowing that I'm being interviewed, but it was just a chatty session. So she wanted to know why I was there, what I thought of market research. And I had no answers to any of those questions. She said, do you have a resume? I said, no. Imagine, showing up for a job without a resume.
Hey, you were 20.
Yeah, nothing. It was like a conversation I was having with a friend, not even thinking that this was an interview. So we have this long conversation and then she called somebody else into the room, and during our conversation, she had figured out that I somehow knew computers. In 1991, that was a big deal, right? So apparently since I had like worked on one, it was like a big deal, right? So she summons this person from the office and she says, oh, this guy, Rickie, he's still studying, but he seems to know computers. So can you just talk to him and see if there's something worthwhile we could use him for? So then this guy, who eventually became my boss, he took me to his room and then, he asked me a little bit about computers. And I don't even remember what I was doing on computers at that time because I was actually studying hotel management. So so this guy said, okay, so we have this project and, we would like you to help and all of that stuff. So a couple of hours later, I reach home and my mother was asking me, okay, so, didn't you have to go for this, this interview that you wanted to give for a summer job? I said, yeah, but I don't think I've got a summer job. I've got like a proper job. And here is my appointment letter. So I was like so kicked about it, like, talking of, entering a field which you absolutely didn't know anything about, and completely different from what you were studying. Because the only thing that I was clear about was that I didn't really want to be in the hotel industry, because I had done these long trainings over there and so on. So it was a decision that I had made that, okay, not here, something else, but not this.
So you were getting educated to find out you didn't want to do what you were getting educated in.
Right. In my third year, if you can imagine. Yeah. So it took me that long to figure that out. But completely stumbled into market research, and that's where I stayed like forever. And the interesting thing was that the first role that I did, the first job that I had in MR with IMRB was more to do with project management. So they had this huge program they used to run for the government at that time, and they needed somebody to coordinate stuff and basically look for ways to make the whole process efficient and so on and so forth. So I completely learned everything on the job. Then I stumbled into qualitative research because I happened to attend a focus group, and I don't really know the purpose why I was there, but there was this moderator who was running this focus group, and it was so interesting. So I walked up to this MD who had given me the job earlier, and I said, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. How do I get into that? So then they gave me that opportunity. So I became a qualitative researcher for a while. And then, there were further collaborations with IMRB, with Milward Brown and so on. So the role that I had kept like morphing into new and new things. So it just kept changing every 2 years, which was, I think that was the reason why I continued to stay with market research, because every 2-3 years, I would have this craving of doing something different, something new, constantly threatening the folks at IMRB that I was going to leave anytime because I was getting bored, and then something new would come along and so on. Then early 2000, I decided that, okay, I've had enough. I think I want to travel the world now. So I want to go work somewhere else. So I interviewed for a position, and this was in data processing. I interviewed for a position with Research International, which doesn't exist anymore, in Australia, by the way, in Melbourne. And I was given a job there. So they said they would be happy to have me. And they processed all the paperwork. And then when everything was done, by then I had moved on to Nielsen. So I went to the head of the office in Delhi, and I said, oh, I've got a job in Australia, so bye-bye. So these people said, look, but why, if you want to go to Australia, like, why didn't you just tell us? We are Nielsen, we are global, we could have found something for you. So I said, okay, but now I've told yes to these guys. So they said, okay, don't worry. Let's see if we can do something for you. So there was this role in New York, which came about. And I was like thinking, oh, should I go to Melbourne? Should I go to New York? And New York sounded more interesting. So so that's how I landed in America. And I was there for like many, many years. And I think with many companies. So I started at Nielsen, went to Milward Brown, went to JFK, came back to Nielsen. So did all that stuff. But then I think 10 years in, and New York City is lovely and all of that, but it's also, I call it a Peter Pan city. You never grow up. When you compare, and there were a lot of my peers who, who moved to different countries, many left India, moved to, let's say, the Middle East, many moved to Southeast Asia, many moved to the US. And I was there 10 years. And by the end of those 10 years, when I would look at everybody else, they had built a lot of equity. Everybody had homes and things and all that. And here I am, like still in New York in that little apartment, because I mean, that's what you do in New York, right? So you don't really grow up. So by then I was also getting very fed up of market research. So I thought, oh, I need to really do something else. And writing was something that I had always been interested in. I was never doing anything formally there, but that was something I knew I was comfortable doing. So 10 years in my life in New York, I decided that I wanted to take a break. And I thought, okay, if I need to do that, I don't think I can afford to do that in New York City, but I can very happily do that in New Delhi. So that's when I decided to shift back to India. So that's what I did. The only problem was that I moved back to India with a Nielsen job. My intention had been to take a long sabbatical, to basically not do MR anymore. But you always have this nagging fear. Oh, what if you jump into this and you have no support, you have some money in the bank, but how far is that going to go? So what are you going to do? So maybe I should hold on to this job and I should try to write along with it. But that doesn't happen. So I moved back to India. I was doing this role at Nielsen, got completely fed up doing it. And then I decided enough was enough. The main purpose of why I had even moved out of New York, I wasn't even doing that. So then I took a complete break from work. And so I wanted to write. So I thought, how should I even start doing this stuff? So somebody recommended that I should do a blog. I should write a blog. So, okay, so I started with my blog. This was way back in 2012, I think, 11 or 12, I can't remember now. So I started this blog and there was no agenda. The whole point was that I wanted to experiment with different styles. I wanted to, write things like, the newspaper article kind of stuff, essays. I wanted to write musings. I wanted to write all kinds of stuff. So that's what I did. Then I attempted to write a short story. And that was not on the agenda, but I wrote one, and it was such a lovely feeling. It was a feeling of accomplishing something. So since that whole experience was so wonderful, I then wrote a few more, and they were all well received on the blog. Then I happened to read a news article in New York Times, which talked about the emergence of Amazon Kindle. And at that time, they used to call this, they used to call something called Amazon Singles, which was just a way for Kindle to, to have a section of shorter pieces that you could pick up for $1 and you could read while you were, taking the subway to work. These small pieces of fiction, could be short stories, could be novellas. And so they had started this section, Amazon had started this section, and they were also heavily promoting it. So I thought, oh, this looks like a great idea. So how about I write a short story and I send it to them and see how that goes. So, a couple of my favorite writers, Robert Ludlum and Ken Follett and all, there's a lot of spy stuff and Nazi Germany stuff, World War II stuff that they've always written about, and those have been some of my favorite books. So I said, oh, I want to think of this crazy idea. So why don't I write some historical fiction based short story? So I'll try that. So that's what I wrote. Now, when I was writing it, that story kind of kept morphing. It kept getting bigger and bigger and eventually became a novella. There was a word limit that Amazon Kindle folks accepted and not beyond that. So I managed to keep my story within that. And I sent it to them. They sat on it for about a month. And then they sent me a note saying, sorry, we can't pick it up, but you are happy to self-publish this story. So I was like absolutely deflated, but I said, okay, so I'll do that. So I did publish that. And I think, Kevin, you read that story. So
Eva Brown and
that was Eva Brown and Gandhi, right? So I wrote that. I mean, it was absolutely experimental. But the whole process of writing that was like the most wonderful experience. It was just such a pleasure to write that story. It was such a pleasure to make or break a character, make them do anything that you wanted to. take the story anywhere you felt like. The whole creative process was just brilliant. It was just brilliant. And it also gave me the confidence to then try to write something bigger and longer and more ambitious. So that's how my novel came about. It's called Pretty Wild Girl. I wrote it in about, I would say, 8 to 9 months. That's how long it took me to write it. And again, the whole idea was that, oh, I want to write a fiction piece. I want to write a pop fiction piece. And I want to base it something like what Sidney Sheldon does with his books. So there's a certain formula that he uses. So I said, oh, I'm going to do that, and I'm going to write something based and set in India, but using that same philosophy of how he templatizes his books. So that's what I did. And the book came out early last year, in Jan-Feb of last year, and it's done. I'm thinking it's done reasonably well. I still need to see the sales figures, but
it's amazing that you wrote that. I would have thought it would have taken 3 or 4 years, because it was 450 pages and a load of characters, very complicated plot. And I was frankly surprised. I don't mean that as an insult in any way, but here's your first effort and all that. And I thought, wow, that's how you made it pretty
maybe
stupid.
it's one of those things. It's like pent up energy, you know. It's you've been thinking about it, and it just spurts. And
you drink a lot of coffee, or?
Yeah. So see, it was. So I knew what I wanted to write, because I wanted to write an Indian Sidney Sheldon book. And I don't know if you're familiar with the author, but all his books kind of follow the same template. So there is this huge plot, and there are multiple subplots that connect to the main plot. There is one, very heavy duty female character, typically female character. And then there are, 2 or 3 other strong male characters around her who kind of, propel the story along. And it needs to be very pacey, very racy. And yeah, so, so that's and of course it needs to have this mystery element going through and through the book, which kind of gets
so tell us about as you developed obviously you've been thinking about this, working at this for quite a while, but then it comes and you get the thing going. And when you have multiple, a plot line but multiple subplots and things like that, how did you go about structuring that? I don't mean in terms of the finished book, but I've read different things where different authors will use what they call trail lines, where they've got like a map that plots literally on a map on a wall, the different trail lines that lead back to where it all comes together or something. Did you have a process for doing that, or?
No, not at all. And in the beginning, I had the idea that I wanted to write an Indian Sidney Sheldon book. But nothing beyond that. So I knew that the way to make it Indian would be that I needed to infuse Bollywood into it and politics, because, those are the 2 things that Indians are, they feel that's the kind of stuff that makes it Indian, right? So I wanted to have those 2 elements in the book. And I had an idea of what my Bollywood heroine is going to look like, but nothing really beyond that. So when I started fleshing out the story, the way it worked for me was to have certain very set milestones. So I knew where the book needed to end, for example, right? I knew where the book needed to start. So I had the starting point and the end point. And I had 3 or 4 key milestones that the book needed to negotiate to get to the end. But beyond that, nothing. So it wasn't as if I had structured my chapters and I knew what I was going to write in the next chapter. When I started the book, I knew a few things. So I knew that it needed to be rooted in its kind of Indianness, but not lose the Sidney Sheldon template. But I knew that it needed to also tell multiple stories at the same time, but make the reader work a little bit. So I didn't want to spoon feed the reader. So that's why in every chapter, I would have 2 or 3 storylines happening together. And one kind of experiment that I wanted to do, and I'm going to throw this question at you guys as well. Have you ever picked up a book in which there are 2 principal characters who have the same name? I have never read a book like that, in which, John is a common name, for example. Is there ever a book where there are 2 Johns in the book? And, you come across that in reality. You always meet people who have your name. But in a book, I've never seen this. So I thought, it would be so exciting if I have this story where 2 characters have the same name. And, the job will be to make sure that they are etched out as very individual characters, but the reader doesn't get confused. So, challenge to myself. Yeah. So I'm like writing the story and multiple plot lines together. So when I would write a chapter, I would know that my next milestone is going to be, XYZ. I need to get there. So I would kind of move the story along in that direction, but not really knowing whether that's going to take 1 chapter or 3. That wasn't, I would not know that. Yeah. So that's a long process. I hadn't intended the book to be 450 pages because everybody had warned me to not write a very big book. But it just ended up being 450 pages, and I couldn't do anything about that. There was just so much story to tell. And then once you start writing all of that, you kind of have to bring all those pieces together. Like you need to close them all out.
So tell us about the book's done, it's published, and obviously, you have to try and promote the book, or the book. Somebody's got to try and. What happened with that?
Yeah, so even before that, the whole process of getting it out there was a challenge. People keep saying that the toughest part about writing is the writing part. I thought that was okay. It took me 8-9 months to do it, but that was done. What happens, once you realize, it's finished. Now what do I do? And I was like, I had absolutely no idea how to take things forward. So what I did was I went to the websites of publishers, just to figure out how does one even, send a manuscript. So I started with Penguin Random House, and they sat with the manuscript for months on end. And eventually they rejected it. But the editor who was the first one who read the manuscript loved it so much that she said, it's kind of not got a consensus here. Like not everybody has liked the plot. So, but I have loved it and this needs to be published. So she made the effort to send it to her friend in another publishing house. So the book then went there. And again, it took a while, they sat on it and then they rejected it too. So this time I actually wanted to know what the reasons were. Like, you sat with it for so long. So obviously, some people were enjoying it. So she says, yes, that's true. What your book eventually did was it split the whole editorial team down the middle. And half the people loved it because they thought this was a hot idea. And the others couldn't read it at all because the first draft was very raunchy. Because in the beginning, I wanted this book to be an adult thriller. So the editors who read it in the beginning, they were so put off by the raunchiness and the rawness of the book that they didn't want to get into it at all. So that was lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 was, this editor telling me that I shouldn't cold call. I shouldn't just, ring the bell and send people a manuscript. That's not the way it's done. I need to go through a lit agent. So, those were 2 valuable lessons. So what I did was I reread my manuscript and toned it down a little bit. That's all I did. No changes to the story, nothing to the plot, just toned down the language a bit and pitched it to India's biggest lit agent who picked it up like that and then pitched it to 3 publishers. And that's when Bloomsbury picked it up. So, so it was kind of a whole year went by, just trying to get all of this stuff done. Then, of course, the book, I worked with my lovely editor and, we just made the book better and did all of that. Once the book was out again, I only took directions from my publisher in terms of, how to promote it, where to promote it, where to go, which sessions to attend. And well, contrary to popular belief, it's not as if I've given too many interviews and done too many sessions promoting the book. A lot of the, a lot of the legwork was done by the publisher themselves, because they would do things like, call it one of their main leads, so that it got the right shelf space in bookstores and, things like that. You learn a lot with your first book. You don't really know how to, how to master the art of promotions and all of that, but I'm wiser now. So, when it's time for my second one, that's when you kind of, know how to negotiate this whole process of promoting the book effectively. I don't think
that
I've been
leads into
effective at all.
my question, or a question I had, and I've had since I finished reading the book, is, will there be a sequel to this, or do you want to do something completely different?
Potentially, yeah. So there have been a couple of ideas, we've discussed with the publisher. One idea is to, to do a sequel, but another idea was to even take this and Americanize it, and kind of, see if there's a Western audience for it. Keep the story, but, make it more American. Like it could be, the heroine could be, a Puerto Rican girl from Brooklyn, right? So it could be anything, right? So,
but then, Rickie, I get that, and I can get why publishers might say that. But then you look at the success of the last year or two of, Asian movies, Asian books, the success in America, for example, of K-pop. And so it seems to me like what's happening is the world is more and more open to books that are based around in a particular culture. I mean, all I got to do is my favorite author is Murakami, but what I'm actually amazed about is the number of people I know in Western countries who are huge fans of Murakami, because they see that as a way of getting interesting stories, but also a window into uniquely, in his case, Japanese culture. I guess as long as you cut the cricket references, Americans could probably understand it, right? So,
yeah, I mean sure, that could be. But from my experience, and of course, I've not really researched this too much, but the kind of fiction that works well when you transplant it from an India to a US is more if it is literary fiction. If it is, God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, those are the kind of books that go win the Bookers and all of that. They are lit fiction. They are talking about the ethos of the country. It's not just, a thriller, which you could really, it could be a story anywhere, right? I keep saying that my book is Indian. It's an Indian Sidney Sheldon, but it's Indian only because the characters are Indian and, they're doing things in the Indian setting. But beyond that, I mean, it's not an education on India. And I think those are the kind of things that probably do better in the West. Again, I could be completely wrong, but Murakami is so big there because, of course, there's this whole Japanese ethos that his books have, but he also talks things which a Western audience has probably not seen in the perspective of how a Japanese or the Japanese
also
culture
he has
presents.
a long list of predecessors. Some of whom who've been dead for decades. So Japan, as a generator of literary quality, has a long tradition already. India, perhaps less so. I understand where you're coming from. That I think that in the West, a lot of people associate India with, dramatic, obviously political figures like Gandhi, or with philosophy. Sorts of things, and that moves it up, but probably have been less exposed to. Well, of course, you have Rushdie and some others who are been on the map for a while too. But yeah, I see where you're coming with that, and I could see how you could set this if you wanted to in New York. Obviously, since you lived there for 10 years and do something. But I wanted to just back up with one more basic question, and that is, I was intrigued by the characters. Not only you had a lot of characters, but They were, few of them were people I would like to meet in real life, but they were believable and they were complex and they were unpredictable. And I'm just wondering, how did you do that? How did you develop these characters? Developing a plot is one thing, but then the characters, that's something else, at least from the point of view of an amateur.
Yeah. A character is basically driven by what is needed by the writer to move the story along, right? So so a character would be somebody who eventually accomplishes three things in the book, right? Or I need a woman to go do these two things so that my principal character can move along, right? So except for the principal characters, who you might want to base on something or someone who's a bit more familiar, a bit more believable. I think the other characters are a bit incidental to the story. So you can play with them, but the main character, yes, that's important. So so I had a couple of Indian actresses in mind. These are people who are very famous, and I should say they're infamous. Like whatever they do, right? Whatever they do makes news. And that's why they end up doing only crazy things most of the time. Yeah. So I wanted the superficial image of my main lead to be based on this person, this actress in India. But there is always a backstory, right? Because if I were to just make this person that superficial image, then I don't really have much of a story to tell. So obviously there was much more happening deeper within her, and that was like a combination of people you meet in your life, people you know yourself, or it's kind of an amalgamation of different people. So this central character that that was there in this book was superficially this actress, and deeply like an amalgamation of multiple people, if that makes sense.
Did you no, you're the way you've described this whole creative process, you've done it wasn't off the cuff. It was very deliberate, very systematic, at least it seems that way to me. And did you actually research, did you read anything by Sheldon about how to write books, or did you have any did you take any courses or anything?
No, none of that. Just having the template of how I wanted to structure the main lead and the story and the plot, and it needs to have multiple things and it needs to have Indianness. So once I had all of those things sorted out, I think it was easy for me to then just write the story. And and just having those key milestones kind of help because they nudge you along. But taking the story from point A to point B, the next milestone in the story, that's completely creative, right? That's what it's all about. That's where the joy is, because you are writing stuff, you are probably scratching and throwing it away, then you're approaching things differently, you are suddenly building a new character, you're suddenly taking the person to Mumbai, to a street that doesn't exist, it's all in your head, but you kind of know how Mumbai looks like, so you kind of populate that in your mind, and then it flows into the story. So the whole joy of writing is taking your story from point A to point B, and then from point B to point C. That whole creativity of it is what makes it. So I have a feeling that if you research too hard about the process of writing, you might get a bit stilted. I also completely think that, okay, maybe that's the way it works for a lot of people, and more power to them. It wouldn't have worked for me.
Yeah, I recall a friend of mine many years ago. He was a jazz bassist, and at least in his early 20s, and he was studying physics in college, and he's also studying bass from Richard Davis, who's one of the the big boys of jazz, and who was very comes from a classical background, very theoretically oriented. And I remember, asking my friends some basic sort of, ABC sorts of questions about jazz and music theory and all that. And I remember him saying, I cannot remember his exact words, but it was basically, don't get into theory. It'll destroy the music. And so he kind of rebelled against that. And, and so I kind of see where you're doing. I think for some people, like obviously Richard Davis, that theoretical approach worked, and many others like that. But for others, they just kind of have to play. And so I guess you were kind of like my friend in that sense, that you went from the gut, basically. I mean, you did some homework, you read a lot of Sidney, Sheldon, and so forth, and decided that he wanted to be your principal role model, but it kind of was more from within.
Yeah. And the other thing that so you can be absolutely loose with your creative process. I think, take as much of it as it helps you, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way a structured approach might help you is to mind your timelines, because you could write a book for years, right? I mean, if you took this loose approach that, I'll write when my creative juices kick in. So, I'm writing furiously for like 3 days and then nothing, right? Nothing for a month. Now, that loose approach of, approaching writing is fine for the creative process, but it probably is not going to help you finish your book, especially if you have a deadline, for, let's say, the second book or the third book. You might, if you're doing reasonably well, you're usually on a deadline. So there, I think a lot of, I guess, tools that people use, the discipline is in, writing something on a regular basis, so that you're moving towards the deadline of accomplishing and finishing the book. So the one thing that I missed in my writing, Pretty Wild Girl, was that I hadn't put myself on any kind of a discipline of writing. And I do see why it helps a lot of other writers, because, even on the days when you're not really doing anything, the story is not forming in your head, you should still sit and write something so that it doesn't feel like a chore. That's the one thing that you should avoid. And there were days, it took me about 8-9 months, like I said, to write this book. But there were times when I just didn't feel like writing. So, I would just walk away and spend like 2 weeks not doing anything. So I don't think that was good. I could have really used the time more constructively, and the book might have finished 6 months in 6 months.
I remember Hemingway had a strict schedule where he would get up at like 5 a.m. He typed standing up, and he had a limit. I don't know, it was like 1,000 words a day minimum. He had that sort of discipline. And this is Hemingway, who was kind of freewheeling.
Right. And this kind of helps. It helps. It helps with, if not with your book, it definitely helps with your, I guess, your marketing and promotion prospects, because because then you're writing. Maybe you're not writing the book, but maybe you're writing a blog piece, or maybe you are writing something else, a book review or something, right? Because you can then keep posting things on social media. You can continue to stay relevant, so people know that you're around. If you just took 6 months of your life and locked yourself in a room and wrote for those 6 months, you will be forgotten, right? And with the and in today's times, there are authors who write very frequently. They have a book or two that comes out every year. So while they are doing their book writing, they also need to continue to stay relevant in social media. So this whole thing about writing at least 500 words a day, 1,000 words a day, even if it's not your book, it still helps you in other ways.
All right.
Well, before I turn this back to Dave here in just a second, and I may be anticipating one of his questions, and that's it. Are there any lessons about storytelling? We're running a little bit short on time here, but any lessons about storytelling that you would have for marketing researchers?
It was interesting. I was having this conversation with a qual researcher. This was a few months ago. in which he was saying that the problem that he's facing today is trying to get talent to do storytelling in the presentations. Now, I don't know how widespread that problem is, but especially in qual, you need to tell a story when you present to the client. I think what people should do is to think of hypothetical situations and try to write, small pieces around it so that you can structure the way you want to tell your story. The problem is that we all have ideas, but we sometimes don't know how to, structure them properly so that they can be communicated properly. So, my best advice is that, we should all write stuff that makes us happy. It doesn't need to be a full-length novel, but, fleshing out a short story, narrating incidents of the previous day. We should experiment small, because, once you're able to structure your communication, the storytelling happens on its own. You kind of acquire that skill as you go along. But it was very sad for me to hear that, this art of storytelling, especially in qual, is kind of going away. Maybe people don't have the talent, or maybe clients don't have the time, which is another unfortunate thing, right?
I'm not too sure it's going away. I think the problem is that it's become so, in all honesty, trendy in the last 5 years. Everybody talks about storytelling in business, and the problem is it's not going away. It's the people we were doing it naturally without calling it storytelling, and now everybody's so focused on storytelling that it's scaring a lot of people. And yes, some people are, obviously I think there's a need for, as you say, some discipline, some training, maybe in how to do it. I think the tips you just gave are really useful, and maybe more people need to think about that. But it's a case I constantly hear this all the time amongst marketers, market researchers, quant, everybody. It's like, oh, storytelling. And you can tell there's a sort of slight panic in the voice as soon as they say the word, which is unfortunate. So, I think that today's session, Rickie's been great as an inspiration of the fact that, wow, you can't, we've got a story probably in us, and you're a great example of that. I hope to hear and read, 3, 4, 5 more stories. So get your act together, son. You're getting slack. You're not creating that one book novel a year, right?
You're not the first one to say that. So my lit agent has probably just given up on me now.
Yeah, don't try to live off your brand equity.
You got to constantly renew. So good luck with that. Hey, Rickie, I always finish all of these things with a question. It's the same question. It's a little bit not so relevant because of what you've been talking about, but given your experience in the market research world and everything, just think about this. In your history in market research, in writing novels and everything, what's the one question that you never asked that you wish you had asked?
Interesting question. The question that I would have asked to myself actually would have been, would I want to do this in 10 years' time when I started off? And the answer to that probably would have been a no. And I would have, just done something differently. But I was too young to make those career calls.
And if we're honest, most of us probably would have had the same reaction, right?
Yeah. I feel very delighted when I meet people who are so clear with their agenda of, how their life needs to go and what they ought to be doing and all of that stuff. I have never been that person. I have never known what I wanted to do with life, but I've always been very clear on what I didn't want to do in life. So, if there were things that were bothering me, I would move away from that. There's no, life is too short for that. But yeah, I feel delighted when I run into people who've chalked everything out so well, and they're literally chasing their dream because they were so clear about the dream right in the beginning. So,
well, obviously, Kevin and I are fulfilling our dream because we both grew up hoping that we could do a podcast about market research.
That's exactly true. I mean, from our first words after we ever spoke, were marketing research realities.
Yes, yep. That's right. Hey, with that, thanks a lot, Rickie. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the session. Thanks very much.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rickie.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.